Good morning, 8th grade. I am here in our classroom in the back wall. I know there's a glare on here, but it's a little bit bigger board than what I have at home, and I wanted to put some notes up for you and begin a conversation with you about a piece of writing that you're going to do. We talked a little bit about this last week. We said, I told you that I wanted you to write a memoir. I don't know how many of you know really what a memoir is. A memoir is a memory, if you will. That's why the word memoir is there. But it's a very specific type of memory that you're recalling and that you're telling in story form. And last week when we were on the Zoom, Teresa asked a great question. She said, well, what's the difference? You know, she said it's like an autobiography. And I said, well, kind of, except it's a little bit different. It's more like a narrative story / essay. Right? So it's autobiographical in the sense that it's your story and you're telling it. But when we think of an autobiography, we think more about factual kinds of details to give just kind of almost like a report on someone's life, where they were born, where they lived, you know, how many brothers and sisters they had, how they grew up. You know, we read autobiographies about, you know, lots of people, but they have a tendency to be more fact-based, and the purpose of the autobiography may be very different than the purpose of writing a memoir. Okay, so the purpose of writing a memoir is to call to mind a memory, and you're calling the memory to mind, and you're sharing it like a story and telling it like a story to your reader, because it's a reflective piece. Okay, so you are identify in the beginning which part of your story you want to tell, and you have a purpose before you begin of why you chose that. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this. I'm going to send you these notes. Basically, I'm going to send them to you so you can print them out in a PDF form, and you can look them over, and then I'll send you along the way some other things too. But what I wanted to do today in this short video was just go over some of the main points and expand on them a little bit with you. And then when we Zoom on Tuesday, you'll have some opportunity to ask me questions so you get a better sense of what it is I'm really asking you to do. A memoir is a very meaningful piece of writing. It's as meaningful for the writer as it is for the reader. But it's one of those things where we read it and we get this very strong feeling that we are just have a glimpse into the writer's life and something specific, an event or a time period that took place in their life that left an impression on them, that maybe actually transform them or change them in some significant way. That's usually why someone chooses the event that they choose to include in their memoir. You can write a novel that is a memoir, and that tells the story of the kind of complete story of someone's life. But even in writing a whole entire novel that's a memoir, it's not the same thing as it always has the same thing in common with this shorter version, which is that it has a purpose, and the purpose is to communicate to the reader how these events were transformational in this person's life, the person who's telling the story. So even though we're only going to look at writing a memoir essay, you've probably read memoirs by people that may be famous, may not be famous. And they don't necessarily give you all the details of their life like an autobiography. They maybe only fill in some of the details that are all going to kind of support this message that they really want to communicate. And it's hard sometimes when it's an event that really impacted you. It's hard sometimes to get that across to your readership. So memoirs, although I think they are a very special kind of writing, they've become incredibly popular because people like to read about people's lives, their real lives, things that really happened to them. And I think what's even more important about the memoir is that it's reflective. So the person who's writing it is reflecting on it. So we know reflecting means that we are going back and looking. That's where the RE comes from. And when we look at our reflection, like we do in a mirror or in a pond or something like that, we analyze, we kind of see our reflection looking back at us. And we know that there's this kind of interesting dynamic that's going on where we can see ourselves over there, outside of ourselves, but we also have that sense of what's going on inside of us. And with a memoir, you are, again, looking back. The event has already taken place. And so it has that piece of being able to look back, and maybe during the time it was happening, you are aware of the fact that it's having a big impact on you, or maybe not. Maybe it's weeks or months or years later when you begin to really digest and understand the transformation that has happened as a result, at least partially, from this event. So I wanted to go through this a little bit, and we'll talk more about this when we're together on our Zoom. And again, I will give you something that has some of this on it, but I wanted to be able to speak to this to you so that you could formulate questions. And again, I want you to just start thinking about, this isn't something that you just decide, oh, I'm going to write about this. You might, but it's probably going to take a little more thinking, and maybe really doing some outlining and some fleshing it out a little bit on how you want to approach it once you decide what you want to write about. So this is called a memoir essay, and it's a personal narrative, but it includes a reflective element. So personal narratives are just a story of something that happened to you. So you've probably written personal narratives, and they're essay types that kids write, especially when they're young, because they're easy to write. You're telling a story about something that you've experienced. So if you tell a story about when you first saw the ocean, or you first went on a vacation with your family, or you went to a special sports camp or whatever, the narrative essay is, you can write in the first person, it's coming from your perspective, it has a pretty high interest level for most people to read, and so they're fairly easy to write. A memoir is a little bit different in that it says it's a personal narrative that includes this reflective element. So it's a little bit harder for a real young person to write a memoir, just by the nature of the fact that they haven't lived a real long time. But it isn't impossible for a young person, even a 5 or 6 or 7-year-old, can tell you about something that happened and why it was important to them. Okay, so it should not be hard for you to have this reflective piece, and actually it's the main part of the story. Okay, so it says you're focusing on one theme or one message or one element that you really want to communicate to your reader. And I use the word theme because I think theme is a nice broad word. It doesn't have to be overly specific, but it has to be narrow enough that you can communicate it with meaning to your reader. Okay. Now, it's not a 5-paragraph essay. As a matter of fact, it's probably going to have more than 5 paragraphs in it. Some of the paragraphs, this is a creative writing piece. So a lot of the things that we talked about when we learned our argumentative essay and how to write persuasion and how to write your speech, those were different formulas for a different purpose. This is, again, a memoir, so it doesn't have to and shouldn't be restrictive so much in its form. It will be written in paragraphs, and in the paragraphs you will have sentences, and you'll use, strong grammar and that kind of thing. But that's not really its purpose. The purpose is to tell the story and to communicate with the reader something that causes the reader to pause and say, wow. Either identify a little bit with the writer, and maybe the reader says, yeah, I've had something like that happen to me, or maybe not at all, but cause the reader to pause and get outside of their own personal experience and then gain something from someone else's experience, an experience that they've never had. So again, it's got five elements, but it's not restricted to 5 paragraphs. And I want to make sure that you understand that. I think once I go through this, it'll become very clear. So the introduction of it, which again could be 3 or 4 paragraphs long, but if you took the essay, and let's say the essay, were 3 pages, I'm just throwing this out, then maybe it takes you a half of the first page to really introduce the essay, or 3/4 of the first page to introduce it. Right, so the introduction of it is going to include these 3 things. It's going to include a hook, and you're very familiar with the term hook, but it's the piece that just draws the reader in right away. So again, this is very different than what we've done together, and maybe you haven't written a creative piece in a really long time. This is about throwing something out there that's going to immediately hook your reader in and make them want to read more. So I'm going to suggest some memoirs and some pieces of memoirs for you to look at online. It's a very personal kind of thing. So when you read it, you immediately feel like you have entered into this person's, like a movie almost of their life, okay? And they're telling it to you in hindsight. So they're looking back and they're telling you this story. After you kind of hook your reader in, you have to set the scene. So it's very, very important early on in the introduction. So you can even substitute the beginning paragraphs, if you want, of the essay to set this up right away so that your reader is not confused, wondering, where am I and what's going on? And how you set the scene, you have so much creative license with this. Now this is something that you're not making up, like this actually really happened to you. So you shouldn't have any problem creating the scene and painting the picture of the scene for the reader. The more details you put in here, the better your memoir is going to be. And we'll talk more about this later. You want to use all of your senses to describe this scene for your reader. So you want to use the sense of sight, what they would be seeing as you describe this. There was sounds that they would hear, maybe smells they would smell, things that maybe touch them. So if you were walking through a forest and you could feel the grass on your ankle or the tree branch brush against your leg, you might be hearing something like the wind blowing or an owl hooting or whatever. Okay, so and if you're not out in nature, maybe you're telling a story about, being in a gym and you can, I heard the kids yelling and the basketballs bouncing, and I could hear the echoing off of the gym walls when I walked in. So you're creating for them this sense of the scene, and as you're doing that, they themselves as a reader begin to identify with this and connect it to their own experiences of being in a gym or their own experiences of walking through a forest and hearing those sounds and feeling the wind blow or the grass on their ankles or whatever. Then the last kind of component of this beginning piece is a thesis. And it's not a thesis like the way that we've used the thesis, that word. It is the central theme of the memoir. So instead of thinking of it as a thesis, like from your argument, what you're arguing, this thesis is more the reflective piece. So it would be the impact that this story, that this event had on you, and maybe even continues to have on you now in your current life, and it's the whole reason why you're telling this particular story. All right, so that's really what they mean by thesis. They mean the theme of it, the central message that you want to get across to your reader, right? So you have to kind of use that with a little, take that with a little bit of a grain of salt. It says on the handout that I'm sending you that a thesis is optional, but for my assignment, it's not optional. I want you to be very intentional about communicating the transformational piece of the story, like what was transformative about it. Transformation means change. So prior to having this experience, you were one way, and after you had the experience, you found yourself in a different place. All right, so it transformed you, it changed you, and it's your job to tell how you were transformed by it. Okay, that encounter, that time period, that event. It could be truly as short as an afternoon, or as long as several weeks, a time period in your life. It just depends, because it depends on what you're going to be telling about. So again, the introduction, or the first part of it, has this hook piece, sets the scene of where we are and what's going on, and then identifies up front what it is. Even if you just allude to it, you don't have to go into a lot of description of the transformative piece, but you want to allude to it so they know that that's why you wrote it, and they're kind of reading for it. As they read along, they're reading for it, thinking, this story ends up changing this person, and I wonder how, and I wonder why. So they've got that kind of set in their mind as they start reading. The second part of the essay is the body of the essay. So that would be where you would tell the main part of the story. And if you, again, had 3 pages, let's say, the body could be the bottom fourth of the first page all through the second page, and maybe on to the top of the third page. That's the main part of the language that makes the story up. The details, the events, it is the story, really, pretty much, action of what's going on. It tells you, at that point, what you're trying to do is show your reader as opposed to telling your reader. So again, you're going to be focusing a lot on trying to create images and pictures in your reader's mind. So we'll talk more about that. You're not just telling them what happened, you're literally creating it for them so that they can, if they could close their eyes and hear you telling them, they would be envisioning it in their head. And they would be creating all of these visuals based on the words that you're using. Okay. The last part over here, and again, we'll talk about this a lot more, is the conclusion of the essay. Now, the conclusion might be, 2 or 3 paragraphs. The conclusion might be one kind of, 3/4 of a page. It's not going to be one paragraph. It may have kind of 3 components within it. But the conclusion, it takes the reader back to the theme. It's the reflective part of why you chose to tell the story in the first place. All right, so if it's about attending a camp, or if it's about something that happened when you were on a vacation, or if it's about something that happened in a relationship that you had, or a move that you had to make, or your parent being deployed, or your dad losing his job, or your mom getting ill, and again, it's not necessarily a negative thing. It can be, it's just an event, or a series of events that has taken place in your life that has left you changed, okay? That's where you talk about that. And that's where you draw all of this together, and you help the reader understand why this was such a impactful thing. Okay, so we'll talk more. I wanted to give you this because I wanted you to have some sense of where you're going with this. And this is not something that's going to write itself overnight. I mean, this is a project, and it's going to take you some time to do it, and I want it to really, be important. It's kind of the capstone of our year together, and it could even be something that's ongoing. A memoir, again, is classically a memory, so you're looking back and talking about how something impacted you, but it could be an ongoing thing. Sometimes if a parent becomes ill, it's an ongoing illness that has changed your life forever. You now have a new normal. Okay, it could be, certainly doesn't have to be, but it could be your reaction and reflection of this pandemic experience. I think we might be a little bit too much in the middle of it for it to be a true memoir. It would be something maybe 5 years from now you would write about as a memoir piece of how you were changed by this. I think a lot of people will be doing that, of all ages and all walks of life across the globe. I think we will see this as becoming a topic, just like we did when 9/11 happened. When people tell the story of where they were the day that 9/11 happened, again, it's as if they were living it all over again. And it's a uniquely personal story, even though it happened to the whole United States and to the whole world. It's again, we experience things on a very deep personal level. So how I reacted and was transformed by living through 9/11 is going to be very different from someone else. Okay. So anyway, that just gives you a little bit of a hint as to where we're headed. I hope this is helpful to you. I would like you to start thinking about it. And then when we Zoom together on Tuesday, I want you to start asking questions and have some ideas kind of jotted down on where you might want to go with this. Okay, see you later. Bye.